Well, good afternoon. Welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian Ben Bacter, and we're here in studio in Tucson, Arizona, with our pastor at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona. One of our pastors, Sean Richards. How you doing?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. Doing good. Having a good day. Had a good weekend. Twins are under the weather, but hey, you know, that's part of life. 3-year-olds do get sick.
Oh, yes.
But we're having a good time. Today is Apologetics Monday, where we take questions from our live stream audience. I'm sorry, this is A Reason for Hope, and we're doing Apologetics Mondays today. I got my merds wixed. But we take questions from our live stream audience about the Christian faith. And today, on Mondays, we do what's called Apologetics Monday, where we laser focus on a topic. So if you do have questions today, It'll have to revolve around today's topic, which is, do Muslims honor all of the prophets? That is one of the claims of Islam. As I said in previous episodes, that whenever we do sort of an Apologetics Monday, we either take an apologetic approach, which means defend an essential Christian doctrine, or we become what you would say more polemical, in that we will go on the offense and try to diffuse or dismantle other religious worldviews or claims that are contradictory to the Christian faith, or would be, I guess, say, would be risen up to contend with Christianity. So that's what we do. And if you are someone who's interested in these kinds of dialogues, I'd encourage you to chime in, use the chat sections in the various platforms that we'll be live streaming to, and you can engage with us. You can catch us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is A Reason for Hope. You can find us by doing just a search, or you can go to youtube.com/ and just type in @AReason4Hope. And again, if you'd like and subscribe, that'd really be awesome. Ask your questions in the comment section. We monitor those throughout the program. You can also catch us on Facebook. Our church Facebook page is Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Arizona. You can go to facebook.com/CCF Tucson. Catch us that way. You can also catch us on the X platform by following our senior pastor. His handle on X is Scott R4H. Pretty simple. You can follow the feed. You can DM a question, or you can follow the live stream, ask your questions there. You can also avoid social media altogether by just going to our website, CalvaryChristianFellowship.com, hit the Watch Live tab. And you can not only ask questions, you don't have to have an account. You can also make prayer requests, which is kind of cool. You can also email your questions if you have maybe a little more background you want to share, maybe you want to keep it personal. That email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. Before we dive in with Pastor Sean, as he's got quite a presentation for us today on, do Muslims honor all the prophets? And of course, he'll explain the relevancy of that question. But before we get into today's topic and your questions, we'll take a moment to pray. Sean, would you do the honors?
I would be honored. Dad, thank you for the honor you've given us to be able to share your word, your heart, and to do so among your people and your creation. While there are those that will be listening to this broadcast that may not necessarily call on your name, but are told by their line leaders that they do, we ask that your light would ultimately shine the truth of your word, the revelation of your Son, and all that you've spoken throughout history in its proper light and context, so that they would not only know who they're ultimately seeking, but also that the one that they have settled for is nothing less than a counterfeit. We are thankful that you have led us into all truth, and we ask that you'd equip us with the kind of heart that wants to share that goodness with others, and to do so in a way that's not only going to get down to the heart of the matter, but to do so in such a way that reflects the kind of attitude that's necessary in a world that's totally unaware of the kind of darkness it's in captivity to. We pray all this in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen.
That is true. So, today's topic, again, Muslims honor all of the prophets, and that may seem like an odd argument for Islam, but the claim has and will be made when you're having honest conversations with Muslims, so we want to make sure that you're equipped for it here. The idea is that Islam is a superior view towards God and his messengers due to the lack of distinction or favoritism made between any of the prophets. And Islam also notes that people like Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, they're all held in equal regard under Islam, and that Christians have, to use the Quran's language, exceeded the limits as far as what's appropriate in our view of Jesus and the other messengers. Obviously, they don't just say this out of whole cloth. They will cite the Quran for it. In Surah 2, 285, we read, "The messenger believed in that which had been sent down from his Lord, and the believers all believed in Allah and his angels and his books and his messengers. We do not differentiate between any of his messengers. And they said, we turned and obeyed your forgiveness, our Lord, and to you is the final return." So true Muslims recognize the lack of distinction between anyone that Allah has sent, be it his angels, his messengers, his books, his prophets. There's no differentiation between any of them. That's Surah 2, 285. And making a similar point, and I'll make sure to emphasize this as much as possible, that's not the only place you see it. In Surah 3 and Ayah 79, we read the following, "It was not for humans that that Allah brings to him the book and wisdom and the prophecy. Then he says to the people, be my servants rather than Allah, but be Rabbayun, by which you were teaching of the book and by what you were Todorasun. Now, Rabbayun is, of course, referring to rabbis or teachers, and Todorasun is referring to what they studied or differed in. And he does not command you to take the angels and prophets as lords. Will he command you to infidelity after you are Muslims? And when Allah took a covenant with the prophet, saying, I brought you from a book and wisdom, then a messenger comes to you, confirming that which is with you, so that you may believe in him and that you may give him victory. He said, did you affirm and take my covenant? They said, we affirmed. He said, so bear witness, I am with you of the witnesses. So, as is the Quran's general format, a conversation between Muhammad and Allah, this exchange or encouragement to challenge people who are taking the writings of their rabbis, their messengers, their prophets, farther than what they ought to, and submitting to them rather than to Allah. So when all of this confusion is being apparently cleared up in the Quran, it's saying, stick to what I've revealed you, what is with you, what I sent to you. And of course, don't make distinctions saying that, oh, well, the revelation of Jesus is superior to that of Moses or vice versa. This is all meant to be held in equal regard. So the conclusion is just that. Islam is considered completed Judaism in the same sense that Christianity claims to be completed Judaism due to its common sources and lack of division or distinction between its sources of divine revelation. And this seems like an interesting, I suppose, asset to Islam when it tries to put an even playing field for all of its sources of information. The focus is only on God. The focus is only on how you submit to Him, that everyone who's spoken in the name of God has had the same consistent message. And so, with a consistent pattern and a consistent understanding of who God is, why not believe in the more rational position? That all sounds fair. But there's a number of problems with this argument as a claim that it has, of course, going for it as far as Islam is concerned. The main and most significant of which is the word prophet itself. Because when we see, for instance, what Islam identifies as a prophet, in the same way that what these prophets said about themselves were all different, we also need to note that the Jewish and Christian prophet has a definition, and that Islam clearly got the wrong dictionary when it was defining these things. First and foremost, if they're going to make that argument, we honor all of the prophets, but we don't mean the same thing as prophets. Well, then you can respect, say, for example, all of them as human beings. You can respect all of them as people who had a relationship with God, but that's not what we mean when we say that they are all prophets, because the Jewish, or into the Christian by extension definition of a prophet is literally in the word. The prophets, or the Nevi'im in Hebrew, are spokesmen, someone who would speak on behalf of another. And it can refer to, in a secular sense, just someone who's communicating on behalf of another, or it can refer to someone in a religious sense speaking on behalf of God. But it doesn't confer any unique moral privileges, any upward status in society. It gives you maybe the opportunity to perform responsibilities as a teacher, and comes with it as well the various backgrounds that were included with them, but it's limited to just that. Just like apostle or a sent out one is referring to their job description rather than a title or office. It's important to understand that when someone is claiming to be a prophet in the Bible, it's defined as a spokesman, and they'd be qualified according to Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 through 22, through the following criteria. First, they'd be the kind of people who would verify God's words with deeds. They'd perform public miracles, which, of course, we talked about in previous weeks, Muhammad never did according to the Quran. We note that they had to speak to God face to face, just like Moses did in Deuteronomy 32, which Muhammad, as we've discussed in previous weeks, never did according to Islam's most authoritative sources. We also note that they would be publicly accountable for the things that they said in the name of God, and would even be subject to capital punishment, execution, if they revealed something false to Israel, which again, Muhammad never achieved any level of accountability to the people of Israel. He executed them for rejecting his messages, not the other way around. So when we're talking about a prophet, it's limited to just that: accountability, miraculous power to verify the message, and of course, receiving this information from God, just like the template of prophets who put God's revelation into writing did, starting with Moses. Now, we don't deny that people interacted with God throughout history. Abraham was able to meet with God face to face, but he didn't perform any revelations. We note that when we're talking about, say, for example, Isaac prophesying, we say even when Christians today are doing a legitimate Bible study, they're exercising, according to 1 Corinthians 14, the gift of prophecy, speaking edification, exhortation, and comfort to men. But this doesn't make them prophets in the same sense because they don't fit this definition. And Adrian, you have more experience than probably anyone in this room, since there's only two of us, of interacting with people who claim to be so-called prophets. We don't have to go back to, say, for example, New York in the 1800s or the Charles Taze Russells in New York, but the idea of someone claiming to be a prophet, they usually try to play fast and loose with that word, don't they?
Yeah, especially when they're claiming prophet in the biblical sense. And I don't mean by the standards you've laid out, but they're using the concept of prophet as they would read it in the Bible and then proceed to make predictions. It's popular even today within many Christian denominations or different Christian sects where they'll say, oh, I have the gift of prophecy, and I'll claim to be a prophet. On a secular level, that's a totally different usage, different story.
Yeah.
Usually the Nostradamus-like type level people who are just simply saying that they have foresight. Sometimes they'll be called psychics, being able to predict future events and things like that. But what's funny is when you watch the practice, whether you're in a church claiming to be a prophet and saying God is revealing things to you and through you, and the secular, there's no distinction between how they carry out the predictions. Usually they're personalized, very applicable to most people, not very specific, and definitely don't follow the examples we see in Scripture as to when God uses a prophet to authenticate their status and God being with them. Those standards are really blurred when you see it applied in modern day.
Yeah, and we've talked about this many times when people say, oh, I'm a prophet of God because I made this right prediction. Well, have you ever made false predictions? He's like, yeah, once or twice, but most of my predictions are true. Well, that would disqualify you biblically because it's either a pass or fail 100% of the time of your
and
career.
that's usually their out, is they'll say, well, no, that applies only to a specific kind of prophet in the Old Testament. Today, prophets are growing in their gifts. They'll make mistakes sometimes, and not a prophet doesn't. Remember, the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, so we're still improving our prophetic abilities. Is usually the excuse that's given.
Which, in its actual statement, was talking about people speaking out of order, not people saying, "Oh, God's out of order" when He communicated through me. That's the point, though. Someone communicating a message from God and being accountable to the words that they said 100% of the time. When Islam uses the word prophet, it's more along the lines of a military and political leader who got that office because they were sent down a revelation. Now, once again, when we say sent down or kitab, the Arabic rendition of this is the idea that Allah has some eternal enunciation, sometimes even when the Quran is noted as being written on gold tablets, 1,000 years before Joseph Smith tried the same scam, was ultimately claiming that this is something that shares Allah's eternal attributes, that the messenger delivers what is sent down, what's present eternally in heaven, comes to this earth in the form of recitation, in the sense of Moses and Jesus in writing, but all of this is meant to emphasize the idea that because you have been given this divine insight, that now suddenly Allah has imbued you with some kind of divine power. The Shia-Sunni split tried to argue that Muhammad's descendants, both legally and biologically, carry some of this supernatural authority. Others read the Quran plainly in the Sunni sources, which is why Sunni Muslims constitute the majority of Muslims worldwide.
It's like 80%, right? Something like that.
Oh, more than that. But the argument is that the Shia imams and successors of Muhammad confer their prophetic power, but the Sunni Muslims argue, though Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He's the last and final prophet. No one carries his revelation power but after him. The Quran is the final revelation, but Ali and his party, the first Shia, was making the claim that he also has that divine status. But with it comes obviously a lot of moral privileges, which we talked about in our last week regarding Muhammad's perfect life, quote unquote. We can talk about them being certainly not sinless. In Surah 48, 1 through 2, Muhammad, as a model for this, is encouraging him in his conquests of the Arabian Peninsula, saying, "Surely we conquered for you a clear conquest, that Allah may forgive you for your past sins and your future sins, and fulfill His grace on you and guide you to a straight way." Now notice, this isn't speaking to Muslims. It's direct to the audience of the Quran, which according to Muslims is Muhammad. So if he's the perfect example and model for Muslims in how they understand a prophet, he is being acknowledged that through his military expeditions, through the conquests given to him by Allah, he is being forgiven for his past, so he has sinned, and future sins. And this is why the idea of Muhammad being sinless and compared to Jesus, while popular in Muslim circles, just doesn't pass Quranic muster. They have to acknowledge this. There were later traditions like Ismat al-Nabiya, if you want to try to pronounce that, but it translated, it just means the protection of the prophets, where they kind of go the Roman Catholic route and saying they didn't commit mortal sins, they just committed venial sins before coming to Islam. That there's the secondary issues, but they're not going to obviously commit shirk, except for the satanic verses. They're not going to violate or contradict Islamic teachings, unless you read any of Surah 33. They're not going to persist in known sin, unless you count him having more than 4 wives, according to Surah 4. On it goes. That's the issue. So they have to always be true in revelation according to later Islamic ideas.
Do as I say, not as I do. Kind
Yeah,
of thing.
no, totally. And we also even note that prophets of Islam can even get false revelations from Satan. Remember, according to Islam, and we'll go more into this in a second, but Adam is considered a prophet of Islam. And in Surah 20, Ayah 120, and this is not the only place, we see him receiving and relating a revelation from Satan to his wife and obeying. So Satan whispered to him and said, "O Adam, I will show you the tree of immortality and of the kingdom that will not perish." So they ate from it. Their nakedness appeared to them. They began to cut and glue together leaves from the garden on them. And Adam disobeyed his Lord, so he was seduced. So notice that Satan gives him this revelation about the nature of the tree, and the author of the Quran doesn't even get the concept of the tree right. It confuses Daniel 7 with Genesis 2. But the idea of them receiving this and disobeying their Lord accordingly, a prophet of Islam could commit something so heinous that it affects all of mankind as a result. We also note that these corrections will later come by Allah, that false revelations from prophets are guaranteed, but Allah will fix it. It says in Surah 22:52, "We did not send before you any messenger nor prophet, except that when he wishes, Satan casts in his wishes." Now, notice what's just been said, according to the eternal speech of Allah. "We did not send before you," referring to Muhammad, "any messenger or prophet, except that when he wishes, Satan casts in his wishes." Now, you can look at a lot of different translations and even the tafsirs commentating on this, but when they're communicating this was in the context of Allah's correction of Muhammad regarding the satanic verses, that in a chapter and verse of the Quran, he affirmed the worship of pagan goddesses, Alat, Alusa, and Manat, and this had later to be removed from the Quran because it was affirming polytheism. So Allah, comforting Muhammad, says, "Oh yeah, this happens all the time." Allah abrogates or replaces what Satan casts. Then Allah fixes his verses. And Allah is knowing the wise. Again, that is Surah 22, Ayah 52. But when we're reading the Quran and noting this allowance of error, this allowance of literal satanic revelations, and that Allah will fix it in the end, this allowance of sin, this allowance and promotion even of things that ultimately end up having Muslims to make up concepts in order to show Muhammad is more dependable than he was made out to be. Obviously, we don't want to hammer this point too far home because with the exception of Jesus, and Islam agrees with us on this, Were any of the prophets of Judaism and Christianity sinless? No. But the arguments made by Muslims that Muhammad is the greatest man in history who ever lived, you have to acknowledge this. When you're noting these people with divine authority and power behind them and allow for character flaws, this is the reason why we bring these issues up. If a person conveys this kind of power and authority as a representative of God on earth, something that Christians and Jews never conferred or understood by any of the prophets. They were not kings. And when a king prophesied, it was a very limited and distinct status. When David, for example, was acknowledged as a prophet, that wasn't the reason he was considered king in Israel. He was anointed for that political office separate from his spiritual roles. But note as well in this, that when Muhammad's given this kind of power, and he's also described as this man of such poor character, that ends up being the kind of person you're trusting for your ultimate salvation. But Christians and Muslims alike believe that Jesus, whom Christians exclusively believe is the ultimate source of revelation from God, can be trusted and depended on as a consistent and reliable witness, not because of later concepts like Ismat al-Nabiya, but because we affirm he was sinless. He was the perfect revelation of God's nature, that he did not deviate from God's nature in his actions or thoughts, that even according to the Hadith, that Satan touches every child, Muhammad included, with the exception of Mary, John the Baptist, and Jesus. So when it comes to all of these very interesting things, we need to understand as well that this military and political office wasn't one that was open to suggestions. They commanded absolute and unquestioning authority. There are some hadith narrations I could mention, but they are vulgar, so I'll just stick to the Quran. Surah 5:101 says, O you who believed, do not ask about things which, if they were revealed to you, it would be harmful to you. Most translations note would result in apostasy or unbelief. And if you ask of it when the Quran is sent down, it will be revealed to you. Allah will pardon you for this. So in the Quran, it's noting and emphasizing, don't ask questions. People will lose their faith over these questions. Allah might clarify it later, but don't ask questions. Wait for more information. Now, at face value, that seems okay, but how is this applied in the Islamic community? If you ask questions about the authority of the Quran, if you ask questions about the life of Muhammad, if you ask questions about the actual teachings of the Torah and the Gospel, what do they cite? This passage saying, shut up, he explained. That's, of course, why it is noted. The authority of the Prophet is the final authority, unquestionable in its authority. And the same is understood not just there, but in other places as well. In Surah 33, Ayah 36, Muhammad speaking said, it was not for a believing man or a believing woman, if Allah and his messenger judged an affair, that they would have a choice in their affairs. And whoever disobeys Allah and his messenger, so indeed they err in a manifest error. So if Muhammad has decided something, and Allah by extension, then you're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to differ. You're not allowed to come to any other conclusion than what's already been decided for you. And as we all know, whenever something inconvenient comes up in Islam, it is ultimately dismissed out of hand and saying, well, I'll be a prophet after Muhammad and clarify these things better than Allah's ability to communicate from all of eternity. I'm, of course, being facetious, but I'm trying to drive this point home as just that serious. The Quran says there's no room for reinterpretation. If Allah and his messenger have decided something, if a prophet conveys this kind of authority, I'd want them to get their facts straight. But as we see that this is not the legacy of any prophet according to Islam, whereas it is in Christianity. This is not the legacy or standard of anyone conveying a revelation from Allah, but it is conveying that of those with a revelation from Yahweh. So when we're talking about these issues, remember first and foremost that if they say, well, we honor Jesus as a prophet, they don't mean the same thing that the Bible means by that. We honor all of the prophets equally. Why don't you just acknowledge that God is consistent in his revelation? That's not the argument. You're claiming that he was a military and political leader, not just a person who spoke on behalf of God. Muhammad certainly did that as well, but understand even with that, what are the claims about a prophet of Islam? That's what you need to emphasize. It's not just that you submit to God, a la the Taqiyya of Tucker Carlson, but it's how you submit to God that makes the difference between Islam and Christianity. Continuing on with this, there's more than one way that you could not only identify prophets, but also more than one person that you would consider a prophet. We obviously have the list of prophets noted in our Bibles. When we go through the Old Testament, we know Moses was the first to put it in writing, but people were able to speak prophecy before him, and after him there are those who are written in the Nevi'im, the books of the prophets, where their names are listed as their books, the books of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, on it goes. But when we're noting even people like Moses and Ezra and other people who were identified as spokesmen for God, Elisha and Elijah and the others, the Quran goes on to note people whom the Bible does not ever identify as a prophet. For example, Abraham is identified as a prophet. Lot is identified as a prophet of Islam. Ishmael is identified as a prophet of Islam. Isaac, even Alexander the Great, a pagan of pagans, he is referred to by the title Dul Qarnayn from the Alexander romances, were considered Islamic prophets. But notice that when you have a prophet, you have something sent down to you, right? Well, what written revelation was given to Adam? What written revelation was given to Lot? What written revelation was given to Alexander the Great? The only written revelations we have are those that were given to Moses and to Jesus, according to Islam. Yet modern-day Islam has to dismiss those because they contradict the Quran, what was sent down to Muhammad. They can't allow for this, of course, to acknowledge the obvious that Jesus and Moses' revelations are reliable, and because the Quran affirms them, it's either wrong because it contradicts it, or it's wrong because those weren't revelations. Either way, Islam is wrong, the Islamic dilemma. But this is the issue as well. If Jesus and Moses were prophets and written down, sent down revelations, what they would refer to as Rasul, or given writing, why is it that of the 313 Rasul, we only have 3, and we're not allowed to read 2 of them? Why is it of the 25 mentioned actually by name in the prophets, that over 124,000, according to Islamic tradition, prophets can be credited throughout all times, places, and to all peoples, that these are the sort of things we should regard, yet all of it stands or falls because the Quran says so? And this is where it really gets down to it, because the Quran itself isn't even consistent about this issue. We read in Surah 2 that they make no distinction between the prophets, but the Quran actually contradicts itself by claiming in one place there's no distinction, while claiming in another place, specifically Surah 17, Ayah 55, that some prophets were made to excel or be superior to others. Surah 17:55 reads, "And your Lord knows best of who are in the heavens and the earth, and indeed we favored some of the prophets above the others." And then it goes on to note David was given the Psalms. So which is it? And notice we're not using the atheist's contradiction as if we don't even know what that word means. By saying any difference in idea means that it's a contradiction. Contradiction, a violation of the second formal law of logic. A does not equal non-A. Two things in the same way and in the same sense can't both be true and at the same time cancel each other out. The Quran claims we make no distinction between the angels, with the prophets, with the messengers, and in the same source says that we've made some to excel them, to be superior to the others, to be above the others. In the sense of honor and reverence, why is it that the Quran can't keep this concept straight if the argument is supposed to be made in favor of Islam, when Islam, the Quran, the written revelation of Allah, can't even keep its facts straight about the nature of the prophets and saying, are they equal or are some made superior or above the others? This is noted in that sense. Now, we can continue on with this, but I think the credibility that the Quran, being a divine source of information, isn't even that in of itself an argument, because what is the reason we're supposed to consider the Quran a revelation, an authority over the Torah, the Gospel, when A, they're all supposed to be equal, yet interpreted through the Quran as supreme, and at the same time, the Quran itself can't produce an argument for its reliability other than you can't produce something better according to those who already believe it's better, so therefore it's from God. produce a surah like it, as we've discussed in previous weeks. This isn't reason to trust this as a divine source of information, and Muslims need to understand this. They won't because, again, you even spell this out for them in any language, they're going to have to reject it lest they risk losing their family, their community, or even their lives. But a religion based on fear is not, of course, one based on reason. And we need to even examine our own understanding of who God is when it comes to what's actually true about the nature of God. And once again, Adrian, in your experiences, when people in or outside of Islam we're approaching Christianity with a relationship of either A, misunderstanding, or even of fear. Did it produce the kind of relationship with God that they should have in light of the Bible, compared to that which is already assumed of Muslims? If I as a Christian say, well, I can't question the Bible or my pastor, otherwise I'm going to hell, is that the kind of mindset the Bible would, of course, cultivate, encourage?
No, the very opposite. And that's a very common characteristic among the quote-unquote cults is don't question my authority. Like if you talk to people from the Mormon faith, and I don't like to pick on that as an example, but there are so many parallels between Islam and Mormonism.
According to the founder of Mormonism.
Yeah, they say, oh, well, that's not that's not producing the fruit of faith. You shouldn't ask those questions. Now, Christians are guilty of doing this, but not as a result of biblical teaching. That's just poor leadership. But there have been many kids who have left the faith in their adulthood because their youth pastor or their pastor said, well, don't ask those kinds of questions. That's be faithful. You shouldn't question God because they're too lazy or didn't know the answer or whatever it may be. That won't happen here. Sean and the rest of the team here in the youth ministry, that's all they do is give students the opportunity to ask the hardest questions, and we'll spend weeks upon weeks trying to get at the answers as a group. But that's one of the hallmarks is don't question what I'm telling you. Believe blindly. And that's another caricature, a false caricature of faith. The Bible explains faith as trusting in established truth. It's a relational dynamic between persons, but it's a trusting of truth, not authority. Whereas other faiths seem to twist that and say, no, faith is blind belief. Just don't question what I say, just believe it. Where the Bible, like with the Bereans in Acts 17, were considered more noble because they tested and questioned everything that the Apostle Paul was teaching by going back to the Scriptures and verifying that the things he was saying were actually true.
And that's in our book.
Yeah, and that's in our book.
So when we see this as a positive example, both historically and in practice, are there Christians that still act like Muslims and say, I shouldn't question?
Yeah,
now, here's the other kicker. Are there Muslims who act like Christians should and say, well, I believe in Islam because of all the scientific miracles in the Quran. I don't know what they are, but I'm going to take my imam's word for it. I believe that Islam is true because of the perfect life of Muhammad. I don't know about the other stuff, but I'm just going to take my imam's word for it.
Well, of course, you're going to have people like that, but it's not because of the result of Islamic teaching. That's as a result of being in a world and culture where truth, when we live in a scientific age, we live in an age where you question things. We live in a world where Western ways of thinking and questioning and freedom and democracy is now public knowledge. It's not a secret here in the West because we're so interconnected thanks to digital technology. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. I can go on Google right now and tell you exactly how a Hindu thinks when it comes to some of these ideas. Or I can go and look at what a Buddhist thinks in Sri Lanka, or I can get cultural understandings from just about any part of the planet, and so can they when it comes to learning more about us. And so people begin to rub off on each other, and so it's not wild to think or believe that a Muslim would behave like a Christian in the sense that, hey, I need to test all things like the Bible says. They may do it as an instinct, as a gut reaction based on how they were raised, but not because Islam taught them to.
Right, and that's where ultimately we need to clarify for our audience what we're actually arguing. Your Muslim friend or family member or fill in the blank may have a very Christian approach towards their religion, but it's in spite of their documents, not in light of them. Your Christian relatives, friends, or even your own walk with God could be very Islamic in its understanding of who God is, but that's in spite of the actual revelation of who God is, the Christian documents, not because of them. So when we want to make a consistent approach towards God, and note the assets that we all have, the fact that all of these things have been handed to us on a silver platter, there's no excuse not to know these things in the area of information, but even taking for account TikTok brain and the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have made this information as bite-sized accessible to everyone else, there are always going to be people who say, I'm going to default to my leaders because, quite frankly, I've got a life to live, and matters of theology and eschatology and all the other ologies are going to be too much for me, so I'll default to them. That's not good, but we at least understand. Now, if I were to speak to a fellow Christian who's saying, well, you're not supposed to question that, brother, we'd go to Acts 17, right? Mm-hmm. If a Muslim in an imam was given the same opportunity to say, well, you know what? I don't need to ask questions because I have absolute certainty and assurance. That might make them comfortable, but what's the truth? The person who's asking questions and given the ability to do so is a three-phase process for a Muslim that's not cultivated in their culture very well. Because A, if they are in an environment where they have the willingness to ask questions, which again, from knee-high to a grasshopper, they're told there's no need. Yeah. When they finally do, people like Nabil Qureshi or Ridvan, for example, they're put in a position where it's like, kind of fighting a uphill battle alone and with everyone I care about against me in this situation. Yeah. But even taking it a step further and going, okay, Muslims honor all of the prophets equally, that seems like so superficial an issue. Yet even in this, you would undermine the credibility of the Quran in its inability to be consistent on that topic. You would undermine the authority and cohesion of the very point they're trying to make, saying that the message of God is consistent. Whereas you ask Moses and Jesus, what was their written revelations? Oh, those have been corrupted. I thought it's been consistent. I thought Allah preserves his word according to the Quran. Yeah. On and on it goes. But yet these small questions are enough to undermine the very faith of a Muslim taken seriously. Now consider this from the other angle for the benefit of our listening audience, you Christians listening, or maybe those who are on the fence about Christianity as a whole. Little questions. It could undermine, but it could also reinforce. Because let's say, for example, and I'm stepping into a real fantasy world here, that if I asked a question about Islam that provided actual answers, that would reinforce my faith, wouldn't it?
Sure.
And if a Christian had the kind of confidence in their Bibles to ask those sort of questions and found them, would it destroy them or would it build them up? It works both ways. The only difference is our Bible actually has something going for it. The Quran has nothing even of itself to argue apart from itself. And that's what we need to have the kind of confidence in when we are engaging with people, because they will boast a great level of confidence, but it's built on sand, to use Jesus' illustration in Matthew chapter 7. If, on the other hand, we've built such a pitiful fortress around a sure foundation, yeah, we may get rattled a little bit because of our poor building material, but the foundation's still going to be there, and that's what we need to have confidence in. Whereas for a Muslim, their only confidence isn't in the Quran, it isn't in the cohesion of the Islamic message. It's all centered around, and this is the real sad part when it comes to all of this, the nature and credibility of Muhammad. Because once again, where do they get the idea that all the prophets taught the same thing? They don't get it by examining the writings of all the prophets. None of them are available. They get it because Muhammad said that all the writings of the prophets are the same.
And this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yes, because as your mentor, Jay Smith, oftentimes is quoted as saying, every belief is about the book and the man. The book is the Quran, the man is Muhammad. And this is where ultimately this argument falls apart. Because if the argument is, we honor all the prophets equally, okay, do you honor any of the prophets the same way that you honor Muhammad? Well, let's go through the list. Muhammad would be treated as the best argument against this position because he's given superior privileges, status, and authority than any of the prophets, not just because he's the only one you hear all this from, but because of even what we see in the Quran and Hadith itself. For example, Muhammad was given special privileges that allowed him to violate commands given to all Muslims. In Surah 4:3, we read that if you fear you cannot deal fairly with the orphans, have sex with what appeals to you from the women, 2 and 3 and 4. So if you fear that you will not treat them equally, so have sex with what your right hands possess, that it is near to you that you may not have hardship. Now the orphans is obviously in the context of war, taking captives for your own pleasure, but this is in the context of marriage. Muslims are allowed 1, 2, 3, or 4, and only under the condition you can treat them equally. In the context of Muhammad's life, what are we told about the number of wives he had? This is Sahih al-Bukhari, the most authoritative collection of sayings of Muhammad, Volume 1, Book 5, Hadith number 268. The Prophet used to visit all his wives in a round during the day and night, and they were 11. Is that 4?
I think it's a little bit more than 4.
Is there like something in the original Arabic where 4 actually means 11?
If I were to ask my son, who's in kindergarten learning math, and he's quite good at it, by the way, I think he would say that, yeah, definitely more than 11.
Okay, so based
Higher.
on the
It's a bigger
scholarship
number.
of the scion of the Van Vactor household, 4 is not 11. Muhammad allowed himself the unique privilege of having 11, and the Hadith goes on to say perhaps 9, not 11. But how many of his right hands did he possess? Certainly in addition to that, and that's referring to captives of war for concupiscence, if you will. But this is the real issue at heart. Muhammad gave himself unique privileges that other Muslims were not allowed to. He revealed something eternally from Allah, and his life told a different story.
And these revelations were obviously always conveniently timed.
And you can see that in live action in Surah 33, one after another. And this is also an instance of Muhammad not treating all 9 or 11 of his wives equally, because in the instance of course, Aisha, his 9-year-old child bride, he was giving her favorite treatment and wanting to visit her more often. So when his first wife, Hafsa, was starting to get old, unattractive, and some sources say overweight, we, of course, note that she was willing to make a bargain with Muhammad so that she could give up her night of intimacy with Muhammad in exchange for that time being spent with Aisha, unequal treatment. And a surah of the Quran was revealed in Surah 33 saying if you find something better, then that is, of course, commendable. You can break your oaths, which, of course, was in the context of Muhammad making an oath to his wife that he wouldn't keep having sex with his slave, Mary the Copt, in one of his wife's beds while she was out at the market. And when Allah said, I didn't tell you to make that promise, I'm abrogating your oath, and you can cancel oaths, and if they don't like it, then they have to deal with me on Judgment Day. That's ultimately the kind of consistency we see in the life of Muhammad. And with him not even treating his wives equally, giving preferential treatment towards an example of him being one of the worst kinds of people imaginable, of him being the kind of person that emphasized the willingness to break his oaths in order to benefit himself in a carnal context. We see him inconsistent in his relationships with his wives and the commands of Allah. What does this say about the kind of person you're treating as an authority when even he didn't recognize the authority he was supposedly exercising? We also note that Muhammad is considered a voice of authority when interceding for the sins of others, when the intercession of all other Muslim prophets won't be. Now, I'll start in Surah 4, verse 64, where we see the emphasis of this, but then I'll go into a hadith narration, which will go into this in more detail. Surah 4:64 reads, "We have not sent any messenger but to be obeyed by Allah's permission. And if they, when they have treated themselves unjustly, come to you, so they ask Allah's forgiveness, the messenger asks forgiveness for them, and they will find that Allah is relenting, merciful." Well, a Muslim would take this surah and ayah of the Quran and argue, well, you see, this is applying to every messenger. Their intercession will be granted on Judgment Day. So if you have a relationship with any of Allah's messengers, they can intercede for you on Judgment Day. Well, let's see that in action. This is narrated Ma'bad bin Halil al-Anzali. This is Sahih Bukhari 7510. It's much longer than this, but I will read the part that's relevant to this conversation. On the day of resurrection, the people will surge with each other like waves, and they will come to Adam, the first Muslim prophet, right? And say, please intercede for us with your Lord. He will say, I am not fit for that, but you better go to Abraham, as he is the Khalil of the Beneficent. They will go to Abraham, and he will say, I am not fit for that, but you better go to Moses, as he is the one to whom Allah spoke directly. So they will go to Moses, and he will say, I am not fit for that. You better go to Jesus, as he is a soul created by Allah and his word, be and it was. And they will go to Jesus, and he will say, I am not fit for that, but you better go to Muhammad. Notice he doesn't say I have sins. They will come to me, and I would say, I am for that. Then I'll ask my Lord's permission. It will be given. He will inspire me to praise him with such praises that I do not know now. I will praise him with those praises which will fall down and prostrate before him. Then it will be said, O Muhammad, raise your head and speak, for you will be listened to. And I ask, and it will be granted at your request, and intercede, for your intercession will be accepted. I will say, O Lord, my followers, my followers. Then it will be said, go and take out of hellfire all those who have faith in their hearts, equal to the weight of a barley grain. I will go and do so, and return to praise him with the same praises, fall down and prostrate before him. He will say, O Muhammad, raise your head and speak. You will be listened and asked, for it will be granted your request, and intercede, for your intercession will be accepted. And then it goes on to note the emphasis regarding various weights and measurements. It's obviously a plagiarizing of Abraham's intercession for his nephew Lot at Sodom. But the argument is that there is no distinction between any of the prophets, right? That all of the prophets have the right to intercede for their followers. Yet what do we see in Islam's earliest and most authoritative, authentic sources? In Sahih Bukhari, we read that Muhammad's intercession alone will be accepted, that Abraham, that Adam, that Moses, that Jesus all default to Muhammad. I thought that they were all equal in their intercession mentioned in Surah 4. This is the point that's being made. And we can go on to others as well, but I think this one really drives home the point. Muhammad is also given preference above all the other prophets in Islam because he's not only the only prophet mentioned in Islam's 5 daily prayers, but in the Tashahhud prayer specifically, he is prayed to on a daily basis. This is quoting again the prayer itself. Greetings to Allah, prayers and good things. Peace be upon you, O Prophet. And God's mercy and blessings, peace be upon us, the righteous servants of God. I bear witness there is no God but God. I bear witness that Muhammad is his servant and his messenger, the Shahada. So in this, what do they say? Peace be upon you, O Prophet. Now, obviously, when people are new in the faith and they get into the prayers to saints mindset, that is something hopefully easily corrected. You speak to God, he is taking care of them. God alone is the audience of your prayers. So when you say, God, please take care of Grandma, that's a prayer to God about Grandma. But if I say, Grandma, I can't wait to see you, and I hope that you're having a good time up there with God, that's blasphemous because I'm making Grandma the object of my prayers. In the 5 daily prayers of Islam, specifically the Tashahhud prayer, what are Muslims commanded to do? Peace be upon you, O Prophet. Not peace be upon the Prophet.
Yeah, or the prophets. I mean, if there's equal treatment, then why is he the one always named, or the only one that's ever referred to in the Hashara and all that other?
So that's the point. When this argument is made as a message of cohesion, of unity, of equality, of consistency in Islam, you scratch even a fingernail's length between the surface and read between these lines, and you realize the lines themselves are the ones that contradict this message, that a plain reading of the Quranic text and even a Google search or two of Quranic sources and historical context to these things would throw that completely out of the water. So understand, they may be able to cite verses, but other verses contradict that claim. They may be able to reference names, but those names aren't even mentioned as prophets according to the sources Muhammad appealed to. And these kind of arguments may sound appealing, but in an atmosphere of ignorance, that's the only way that they survive.
And how do they use these as an argument? I mean, how would someone say, how would they use this subject as an apologetic, or even a polemic against Christianity, but as an apologetic for Islam? Like,
in my experience,
it doesn't make much sense to me, is why I ask.
Majority of the time, yes, that's going to be common. In my experience, it's mostly an argument that you're exceeding your view of Jesus. We believe Jesus, but we also believe Muhammad. We also believe Moses. Why don't you believe, since we affirm all of your beliefs?
So really, it's an anti-Trinitarian polemic, not an Islamic apologetic.
Or just an ultimate attempt to build common ground when there is none, and it's not necessarily deceptive. Certainly there are people who know better and still use this argument, but someone who's trying to make a case on the basis of you not actually knowing what you believe or what they believe.
Because if they're talking to a Christian who believes in the deity of Christ and that Jesus is part of the Godhead, I could see how they would use this argument. Oh, well, see, here's why you're in error. We believe in one God, and he would never, as someone once said to me, I was in London near Hyde Park. We were doing Speaker's Corner stuff, and this guy, I'm sitting here having this long dialogue. We're handing out, Bibles and stuff, and he's like, "But how could God come down and just be a baby pooping and peeing on himself?" And he said it in a very derogatory manner.
And we'll deal with that in the future.
And he just, it was so, like almost as if God could never condescend to that level, and you're elevating Jesus too much. We honor Jesus as a prophet. We honor all the prophets, and so whenever I hear this argument, it's always in the context of a polemic against Christianity. You're wrong, and here's why we're right. See, we're doing it correctly, as you said. We're honoring all the prophets, but then when you said, like you said, you dig a little deeper, and you realize, well, not really. You have your own version of Jesus in a sense.
You have your own version
you
of what a prophet is.
You may not call him divine, but you pray. I mean, he's acting as if he's God on earth in a sense.
Even in the Quran, because in that hadith narration, was he referred to a soul created from him and his word? Isn't that the same term used to describe the Quran as eternal? But anyway. No, that's the issue. So when you are willing to engage with people, this kind of information is going to help you. But understand that 99.100% of the time, you're going to encounter Muslims that have never been allowed to even think in these terms, let alone hear evidence contrary to them. You go to any sort of environments like New York or Dearborn, where, of course, Islam is pretty much dominant at this point. They will say, well, you tell your Christian to show you where the word Trinity is in the Bible. Well, that's going to sound convincing to people who've never had a conversation with a Christian who knows what the Trinity is even spelled like, let alone able to articulate it in any sort of way. And, of course, it's just going to reinforce what's commonly referred to on the internet as the 99-1 rule. A crowd of 99 Muslims is just going to thump their chest and say, yes, we strong. Whereas the one person that's willing to ask the question is intimidated into silence by the other people and say, I am rather just going to stay comfortable with my community rather than dig any deeper into this, since, of course, according to the Quran, Allah guides whom he wills and misguides whom he wills. I'm glad that Allah didn't guide me into deception. I'm just here with the right crowd. And that's not because of anything true. It's because of the crowd. And we need to be able to have, I guess, a moniker of patience in that regard, because if we were in the same situation and it was just a mob mentality like medieval Europe, that would, of course, be a very challenging place where many of our brothers and sisters in history have died for even translating the Bible into German and English. But if, on the other hand, we're put into a situation where that kind of person is willing to push back against that kind of boundary, that kind of limit, that kind of isolation and manipulation, and say, in spite of all this, I have a love for God that's willing to examine these things, even if it hurts me, even if it costs me my family, wink, wink, that if I forsake father and mother, I'd rather be worthy of God than in good standing with them, you find yourself an awesome Christian. But if, on the other hand, you aren't even adequate in your Christian calling to be the kind of person to push back against someone who blasphemes God every single day and is unaware of the fact they're going to have to answer for that with everything that's been handed to them by this pedophile and warlord, then we need to ultimately get down to where our priorities are at. Because if a man says, I love my life more than my fellow brethren, how does the love of God abide in him? But if, on the other hand, I say, well, I don't even want them to think negatively of me, what in common do you have with Jesus, who was willing for people to hate him if it meant he obeyed his Father? And if, on the other hand, as well, this isn't complicated information. This is something that's
Yeah,
been
it's pretty straightforward.
compiled in less than an afternoon because A, I knew where to look, and B, I'm willing to cross-examine these sources with a little bit of experience. But my ability to retain information is no more a reason for people to default and say, well, let Sean handle it. No, we're here to equip you for this. You're the one who are thinking of that Muslim friend or neighbor. I'm thinking of people like Saqib and Talha, my dear friends, who need to hear the gospel and are still willing to put up with me, but of course also hear about these things on a regular basis. When you're thinking about the people in your life who don't know God but are willing to, leave them alone on their way to hell. It kind of goes back to that conversation that Penn Jillette was oftentimes quoted as saying, right?
With the guy, the nice man that gave him the Bible,
Yeah, he was an avowed atheist, and he obviously didn't convert because of it. But in his
But it was a
blog
profound
post,
experience for him, though. And he tells the story on video. It was just so sincere. And then he makes a comment at some point about how if he really believed that stuff, he would do that and much more. He would crawl through broken glass to tell one person about salvation if it was really true. If I'm really going to be saved from eternal separation from God, eternal damnation, I would do everything I could to tell every person that I could, especially those whom I love.
and vice versa, how much would you have to hate me if knowing all of that to spare my feelings and distance yourself from me if that's what you actually believed?
With the minute we have left, how do you balance the polemical versus the apologetical? And what I mean by that is, someone once said, if you throw mud at others, you not only get your hands dirty, but you lose a lot of ground.
Yeah.
The idea being that and this is a false caricature I'm presenting, but if I go and beat up another person's worldview, rather than focusing on the love of Jesus, am I not doing more harm than good?
No, because Jesus combated worldviews directly. He called Pharisees blind guides, hypocrites, sons of hell, and snakes, and on it went, but it didn't mean that that was his only forte. The key difference is a continuation of the conversation, and sometimes that requires an adjustment of formatting, but it doesn't mean the formatting of the opportunity. When I'm talking, and you saw it even last Thursday when we were talking to someone who was saying Islam is the only hope, I can be nice, but I can still combat someone and call Muhammad a false prophet.
He can be nice.
be nice.
I know you are wondering when and where, but we've all seen it.
And also noting as well, niceness isn't what Jesus was at all times and all places.
Well, would they make a distinction between, well, we're out of time, but we can continue this conversation, polemics versus apologetics. That might be another Apologetics Mondays that we can cover again.
It will.
Yeah. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you tomorrow.
God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.